The winter morning was sharp enough to cut through wool coats and confidence alike, as the group of freshly graduated military academy officers gathered inside the old stone classroom that had once been part of a forgotten fortress. They were men trained in discipline, tactics, and doctrine, selected from the best cadets their academies could produce, and now assembled for what they believed would be a routine strategic seminar before their first real field postings. The room smelled of chalk dust and damp history, and at the front stood a man who did not look like any instructor they had known before. He was not wearing a crisp uniform, nor the decorations of rank that usually commanded instant respect. He was simply introduced as a former school teacher, temporarily assigned to deliver a lecture on problem-solving and adaptive thinking. Smiles flickered across the faces of the graduates as they took their seats, assuming this would be an easy hour, something abstract and academic, with little relevance to the real world they believed they were about to master. The teacher began without raising his voice, asking them to imagine a battlefield where every rule they had learned no longer applied. He spoke calmly, describing how wars were rarely won by those who followed manuals perfectly, but by those who understood people, terrain, and uncertainty better than their opponents. Some officers leaned back, arms crossed, already dismissing him, while others listened out of politeness rather than belief. Then he posed his first challenge, presenting a scenario involving a fortified enemy position, superior in numbers and equipment, with limited time and no possibility of reinforcements. The graduates immediately began offering textbook solutions: encirclement, artillery preparation, coordinated assaults, all delivered with confidence and technical language. The teacher listened, nodding occasionally, then asked a single question that silenced the room. He asked how many civilians lived in the surrounding villages, and what their loyalties might be. The question unsettled them, because it was not something emphasized in their tactical diagrams. He pressed further, asking what would happen to morale, supplies, and intelligence if the population chose to resist silently rather than openly. One by one, the confident answers unraveled, as the officers realized their plans assumed a passive environment rather than a living one. The teacher then quietly dismantled each proposed solution, not by contradicting doctrine, but by exposing the assumptions hidden within it. He showed how an enemy might exploit predictability, how rigid planning could be turned into a weapon against those who relied on it. He told a story from his years teaching young students, explaining how children, when underestimated, often found creative ways to solve problems adults believed too complex for them. War, he said, was no different, because it was ultimately fought by humans, not diagrams. The room shifted as the graduates leaned forward, curiosity replacing amusement. He introduced a second scenario, this time involving deception and limited resources, and asked them to write down their solutions individually. When they finished, he collected the papers and read a few aloud, highlighting how similar they all were, despite the officers coming from different academies. This uniformity, he explained, was both their strength and their greatest weakness, because an enemy trained to think differently would anticipate every move. He then revealed his own solution, which involved no direct confrontation at all, but a series of small actions designed to create confusion, delay, and doubt within the opposing force. It relied on understanding routines, exploiting pride, and allowing the enemy to defeat themselves through overreaction. The graduates were stunned, not because the plan was complex, but because it was simple in a way they had never been encouraged to consider. As the session continued, the teacher challenged them to abandon rank and hierarchy within the classroom, asking the youngest officer to critique the most senior one. This act alone disrupted their ingrained habits, forcing them to listen in new ways. The discussion became intense as egos clashed and ideas collided, but the teacher guided it carefully, ensuring that no voice dominated for long. He emphasized that leadership was not about always having the answer, but about asking the right questions at the right time. By the end of the hour, the graduates realized they had been outmaneuvered intellectually, not through superior authority, but through perspective. The teacher concluded by reminding them that history was full of victories achieved by those considered amateurs, outsiders, or inferior, precisely because they refused to fight on expected terms. As they filed out of the classroom, the earlier smiles were gone, replaced by thoughtful expressions and an uneasy awareness that their education, while impressive, was incomplete. None of them would forget the lesson that day because it revealed a truth more uncomfortable than any battlefield drill, that real mastery required humility, imagination, and the willingness to learn from unexpected sources. The following week, the same group of officers returned to the classroom, carrying with them a different energy than before. The laughter and casual confidence that had filled the room on the first day were replaced by quiet focus and an unspoken determination to prove that they had learned from the embarrassment of being intellectually outplayed. They expected the teacher to repeat the same method, but this time they believed they would anticipate his tricks and counter them with sharper reasoning. The teacher arrived exactly on time, carrying nothing but a piece of chalk and a thin notebook that looked more like a student's journal than an instructor's guide. Without greeting them, he wrote a single sentence on the board and stepped aside, allowing them to read it in silence. The sentence described a small defending force holding a mountain pass against a larger advancing army during a harsh winter, with limited food, ammunition, and time. The officers immediately recognized echoes of famous historical battles and began whispering references to strategies they admired. The teacher turned and asked them to forget history for a moment and imagine they were present, not as commanders, but as ordinary soldiers responsible for the lives of those beside them. This shift in perspective unsettled them, because it forced emotion into a process they had been trained to keep strictly analytical. He divided them into groups and instructed each group to design a plan not for victory, but for survival for as many days as possible. The room filled with intense discussion as the officers debated whether to hold ground, withdraw, negotiate, or attempt a risky maneuver. When they presented their plans, the teacher did not criticize immediately. Instead, he asked each group to assign real human consequences to every decision, such as hunger, fear, exhaustion, and the possibility of betrayal. Slowly the plans began to feel heavier, less elegant, and more fragile. The teacher then introduced new information, altering the scenarios slightly, by revealing that the local population was divided and that weather forecasts were unreliable. Groans spread across the room as carefully built strategies collapsed under the weight of uncertainty. The teacher smiled gently and said that this frustration was the point, because real situations rarely respected preparation. He reminded them that flexibility was not a weakness, but a form of strength that allowed leaders to adapt without losing purpose. One officer, frustrated by the constant changes, challenged the teacher directly, asking how one could ever plan effectively if variables never stopped shifting. The teacher responded by asking him how he prepared his students back when he taught children. He explained that he could not control the questions they would ask or the mistakes they would make, so instead he focused on teaching them how to think, rather than what to think. The same principle, he said, applied to leadership and strategy. He then surprised the officers by admitting that he had no perfect answer to the scenario on the board, and that anyone claiming certainty in such conditions was either inexperienced or dishonest. This admission from someone guiding them carried more weight than any confident lecture could have. He followed by recounting a real incident from his past, not on a battlefield, but in a classroom, where a disruptive student had undermined his authority. Rather than punish the student, he changed his approach, turning the disruption into responsibility by asking the student to help lead discussions. The result was unexpected cooperation and improved outcomes for everyone involved. The teacher drew parallels between that experience and dealing with unpredictable opponents. explaining that resistance often softened when people felt seen rather than crushed. The officers listened intently, recognizing how rarely such thinking appeared in their manuals. As the session progressed, he assigned a final exercise, asking each officer to write down one assumption they had always accepted as unquestionable. The room grew quiet as pens moved slowly, some officers staring at the paper for long moments before writing anything at all. When they shared their answers, themes emerged, including beliefs about obedience, strength, hierarchy, and victory. The teacher circled these words on the board and asked them to imagine an enemy who understood these beliefs better than they did. He showed how each assumption could be exploited, how obedience could become hesitation, how strength could invite overconfidence, how hierarchy could slow decision-making. The realization was uncomfortable, but undeniable. Before dismissing them, he asked them to keep their papers and revisit them after their first real deployment, promising that the words would look different then. As they stood to leave, the teacher finally addressed them with something close to encouragement, telling them that their training was valuable, but incomplete, and that true competence came from blending discipline with empathy, structure with creativity. The officers left in silence once again, but this time it was not confusion that filled them. It was a growing awareness that the world they were preparing to face was far more complex than any academy course had suggested, and that the quiet man with chalk-stained fingers had given them something no formal ranking ever could, a way of seeing beyond the obvious and questioning even their own confidence. Months later, after field exercises, deployments, and encounters with realities far messier than simulations, the officers gathered once more in the same stone classroom. Though now their uniforms showed wear, their faces carried fatigue, and their movements lacked the crisp certainty they once displayed. Some had led patrols through unfamiliar terrain, others had negotiated with local leaders under tense conditions, and a few had already experienced the weight of making decisions that could not be undone. The teacher returned as quietly as before, yet the atmosphere had changed completely, because this time no one underestimated him, and no one underestimated the complexity of what they were doing. He looked at them for a long moment before speaking, as if measuring not their rank, but their experiences. He asked them to speak freely about what had surprised them most since leaving the academy. At first, the room was hesitant, bound by habits of restraint. But slowly, stories emerged of plans that failed because of unexpected human behavior, of orders that made sense on paper but collapsed under pressure, and of moments where listening mattered more than commanding. The teacher listened without interruption, occasionally asking gentle questions that encouraged deeper reflection rather than judgment. He then asked them to recall the assumptions they had written down during their previous session, and whether those beliefs had held up in the real world. Several officers admitted that some assumptions had cracked almost immediately, while others had eroded slowly through repeated contradictions. One spoke of how strict hierarchy delayed a critical decision. Another described how displays of strength escalated a situation that might have been resolved peacefully. The teacher did not say, "I told you so." Instead, he nodded, acknowledging that understanding often arrived only through experience. He then presented no scenario, no written sentence on the board, no structured exercise. Instead, he asked a simple question about what kind of leaders they wanted to become, not in theory, but in practice. The silence that followed was deeper than before, because the question demanded honesty rather than technique. When answers finally came, they were less polished than academy responses, but far more sincere, touching on responsibility, restraint, adaptability, and the desire to earn trust rather than demand it. The teacher smiled faintly and said that this was the first time he felt they were truly ready to learn. He explained that education, whether in a classroom or in service, was never about proving superiority, but about reducing the gap between intention and outcome. He shared that his role had never been to outsmart them for the sake of pride, but to create discomfort early, so that it would not overwhelm them later when the cost would be far higher. He told them that many institutions trained people to be right rather than to be wise, and that wisdom required the ability to accept uncertainty without paralysis. One officer asked why a schoolteacher had been chosen to teach them these lessons, instead of a decorated commander. The teacher answered that commanders often taught what had worked for them, while teachers focused on how others learned and adapted. Both were valuable, he said, but in different ways. He recounted how over years of teaching, he had learned that the moment students believed they already knew enough was the moment growth stopped. He saw the same pattern in organizations that relied too heavily on tradition and authority. He reminded them that enemies evolved, circumstances shifted, and that clinging too tightly to past success could become a form of blindness. As the discussion continued, the teacher challenged them to think about how they would pass these lessons on to those under their command. He emphasized that leadership multiplied through culture, not speeches, and that small daily behaviors often mattered more than grand strategies. He urged them to encourage questions, reward thoughtful dissent, and remain alert to voices that were usually ignored. The officers recognized the difficulty of this task, knowing how easily systems reverted to habit under stress. Before the session ended, the teacher asked them to stand, not as officers, but as individuals, and look around the room. He asked them to remember this moment, not as a lecture, but as a reminder that learning did not end with graduation or promotion. He told them that someday they might be the ones underestimated by someone younger, quieter, or less decorated, and that their response in that moment would reveal whether they had truly absorbed the lesson. As they prepared to leave, one officer turned back and asked whether the teacher believed they would succeed. The teacher paused before answering and said that success was not guaranteed, but awareness improved the odds. He added that the fact they were asking different questions now than they had on the first day was already a sign of progress. When the door closed behind them, the classroom returned to silence. But something enduring had been planted in those who passed through it. They had learned that being outsmarted was not a defeat, but a beginning, and that the most powerful advantage any leader could possess was not superior knowledge or rank, but the humility to learn from unexpected teachers, and the courage to think beyond what had always been taught.